Have you ever been on social media and seen other people's work, maybe their creative work, depending on the industry you're in? Maybe it's art, or you write, or you do music, or whatever. And you've seen other people's stuff. Maybe you follow a bunch of other accounts, other people in that industry, and you see their stuff and you think, I should just quit. Or maybe it's not that dramatic, but you see all these people and how good they are, how successful, and how great their work is. And you think to yourself, man, I could never, ever measure up to that. I could never be that good. And it's discouraging. Well, I want to talk about that briefly because I've dealt with that immensely, and it has been weighing heavily on me recently. But also, I just kind of want to talk to people who are facing that, who are facing this comparison trap, because the impact is pretty grand. If you think about looking at other people's work and feeling like your work will never measure up, it does a couple of things. The first is that it sets inside of you this already kind of defeating attitude, this limiting belief of your work ever being good. Because if you're always comparing your stuff to someone else's, you're never going to reach that. Both on the level that you're never going to reach it because, one, you're not that person, but two, if that person has been at their craft for years and years and they have, perfected it, or they've gotten really good at their unique thing, you'll never reach that because they're way ahead of you. But also, it's unique to them. So if you're trying to do that thing that they're doing, you're not going to do it because you're not them, right? So this kind of leads into the second part, is that then you might, as the author or artist or whatever, you might start taking that stuff on yourself because you're trying to mimic what they've done. And, a lot of times in the business world, in the marketing world, in the self-help industry, they talk about this idea of like modeling, right? I think this became big with like Tony Robbins and some of the original self-help gurus of modeling. You just basically do what successful people are doing so that you yourself can be successful. And I understand in principle how this what this sounds like, right? I believe that we should have fundamentals. I believe that we can look at someone who's successful and maybe look at the foundational things or the fundamental things that they are doing. I'm pretty sure that, most athletes who are top tier athletes are following very similar regimens for their health, for the way that they work out, for the way that they approach the game. But the way that they actually act in that thing, if you're trying to emulate the personality or uniqueness of the person that you are trying to emulate, you'll never, ever do it. And what this does is then you start to just mimic what other people are doing in the way that they approach it themselves. And you start to try to be that person instead of yourself. And maybe you take on, their regimens because you think that if you follow this specific regimen that works for this person, it'll work for you. For instance, I'm a writer. I used to think that I had to follow the same writing regimens as some of the famous writers, and the way that they wrote, in the way that they structured their their writing plan, the way that they approached it in their mental capacity, right? And I think that the problem is there's so much noise on social media to kind of confuse us on how we should approach things, right? It's like, oh, look at these successful artists or authors, and these are all the things that they do. So, obviously if it works for them, it works for you. The problem is that so much of the advice out on the internet is one size fits all, and it's not. It shouldn't be. Just because something works for this, this artist or this author does not mean it's going to work for you. Now, I'm not saying you can't try different things to maybe learn from it and to kind of look at, what works for them and just kind of, really take a deep look at why it works for them. But again, we look at this one thing that works for this one person and think, well, it's going to work for me. Probably not going to be the case. But again, you can learn from the fundamentals. Well, why do they do it this way? Oh, okay, it helps them in this way. Or why does this author, why are they successful in this genre, but this author isn't, who's also a talented person? There's a lot of different things in that. But I want to come back to the whole point of comparison and the comparison trap. The underlying problem is that we feel inadequate. we feel like the stuff that we do doesn't matter, that it's not as good as someone else's. And it will eventually kind of put us in this cycle of always comparing ourselves and then always being defeated. And then actually we sabotage the work that we're doing, because when we're sabotaging ourselves, we're trying harder and harder and harder to meet these invisible expectations that we have set for ourselves, and we will never reach them because we just keep pushing the bar, or we're lowering ourselves, so we're getting further away because we're widening the gap, because we're striving for something that is not even rationally attainable. And I've dealt with this. I've dealt with, like I said, I write, I do videos, and I've painted, and every time I find that at some point I start comparing my work to the work of others. Oh, these people are making way better videos, so I need to start emulating them, or I need to start, doing exactly what they're doing. Even though it doesn't feel natural to me, I start forcing myself to do things that other people do only because it's working for them, not because it feels natural to me. And again, I'm not saying you can't try new things. I'm not saying you can't learn from other people. What I'm saying is when you start mimicking other people, and it starts feeling unnatural to you, like it does not align with who you are as a person, you're not even going to get good results then. So just because someone else gets good results in doing that thing, even if you followed it to a T, that does not mean that you are going to get those results, and you're going to feel even worse because it's not authentic. It's not genuine to you. And I've dealt with this in my writing, where I start mimicking other writers and I start trying to write just like them. And again, it's a trap, because now I'm not writing as myself, I'm writing as other people. And guess what? Here's a little thing that I've learned, especially in writing, that you tend to have more writer's block when you're trying to write things that you think will impress people, or things that you think should sound a certain way because someone else wrote it a certain way, instead of just writing how it naturally comes to you. If you start getting into a flow state, if you start getting into this kind of stream of consciousness writing where you stop caring what goes on the page and you just put the dang words out, you write so much cleaner, because you can always make it look better, but just getting it out on the page is important. Now, the point out of all of this is to encourage you, is to remind you that whatever makes your art or your writing or your videos or whatever unique is the part of you that you should be leaning into. Again, I've dealt with this where I started mimicking other people's styles just because I thought that their style was better than mine. And so because of that, I felt inadequate in my own style. Or I started comparing my stuff to theirs, so I kept making everything I do, held up to this bar that didn't even make sense, because one, they didn't know about it, but two, I was just imposing these limits on myself over and over and over, and I kept not meeting them. So then I kept being disappointed. So it just kept driving me further and further into this downward spiral. So essentially, how do we break this? How do we get out of this comparison trap, and how do we feel better about the work that we're doing? Well, I've got a couple of tips, although ultimately it's going to come down to your own efforts. So the first thing is to basically accept that everyone is different and unique in the way that they approach things, and that's okay. Not to get biblical, but the Bible even says that the student is not greater than the master, or the servant is not greater than the master. Sorry, the student is not greater than the teacher, and the servant is not greater than the master. I apologize. But essentially what it's saying is, like, we could get up to a certain level, but we will never surpass the person who was our mentor. And I'm not even saying you have to have a mentor in this. What I'm saying is that if you're comparing yourself to someone who is better at something than yourself, then you're just always going to be disappointed, because think about it this way. Even if I saw someone who was better than me, and I worked at that craft for 20 years. If that person was still working at their craft and getting even better, then I will always be following that gap, right? So instead, I should be looking at not other people, but, and this leads into my second thing, but you should be comparing yourself to yourself. You should be comparing you to you. And what I mean by that is you should be looking back at your own stuff and saying, have I progressed in my own style? Have I progressed in my own, approaches? Have I, progressed in the results that I'm trying to do? When I was painting, my painting got a little better over time because I learned more foundational things. I learned more fundamentals. I learned from other things, but mostly I learned from my own past mistakes. In the writing, you get stronger when you write, and even when you read. Because again, I'm not telling people not to look at things for inspiration. You can take in inspiration. If you're a writer, you want to read to take in inspiration. If you're an artist, you want to look at art to take in inspiration. If you're, a YouTuber, you should watch YouTube videos that are well crafted so you can take in inspiration. But as soon as you start comparing your work to that work, that's the problem. So as soon as you say, wow, they're really good, I need to do that, that right there should be a red flag. Now, again, you could look at it objectively and say, what is it that they're doing? Maybe there's something I can learn from this. Learning is okay. Comparing is not. There's the famous phrase that comparison is the thief of joy. And it is so true. I know it firsthand. As soon as I start comparing myself to other people, other artists, other authors, boom, it's over, right? And again, what works for one person doesn't always work for everyone else. So you need to compare yourself to yourself. You need to look at the stuff that you've done and say, have I grown? Have I progressed? And you need to celebrate that. When I look back at my original writings, I'm like, man, that stuff was not that great, right? I was very insecure. I overwrote. I just described everything because I was too worried about, people not getting what I was trying to say. But now I'm just like, I write a lot leaner because I'm like, okay, I just need to get the message across, and then I can, add to it, or I need to add just enough detail that the person understands what's going on the page. I don't need to sit there and fluff it up, right? Insecure people tend to fluff things up. Next, celebrate what makes your art or your, work unique, and really lean into that. So, in my writing, I tend to be very dialogue heavy and action oriented. And, in the past, I've tried to write like these other authors, Stephen King, Cormac McCarthy. I think they're very talented authors, Ted Dekker. And I've always tried to start writing like them after reading a bunch of their stuff. And that stuff is going to bleed into your work. But at the same time, I don't want to be those people, right? I need to write however it just comes to me naturally, because whatever you keep gravitating towards is probably the thing that's probably most resonant to you. And so you should celebrate that. You should celebrate whatever makes your work unique. I've seen a lot of artists that, they draw very simple cartoons, right? And I know that there are people out there that look at that and they're like, oh, this is garbage. You should write more, or you should draw more like this. Or if you make videos, people say oh, these videos suck. You should make them more like this. It's again, a trap. Whatever you feel comfortable doing, you should lean into that. You want your personality, your voice, your uniqueness to bleed through it so that when people see that, they say, oh yeah, that's so-and-so's work, right? When we read, a Stephen King novel, we know it's a Stephen King novel because of the writing. When we watch a YouTube video of someone we like, we stick around because of the personality. When we, look at the art of an artist, we recognize it because, one, the artist probably has done many pieces in that similar fashion, but two, we just know it because we're familiar with that artist's personality or the way that they approach things. So whatever you do that makes you unique, you should lean into that and really make that your kind of forefront. Don't be afraid of the way that you do things, because it's not going to fit into some kind of mold that other people kind of fit into. You should really be excited about the fact that whatever you do that makes you unique, and make that your selling point instead of hiding from it, instead of shielding it oh yeah, I also tend to, make them this way. I tend to write this way, or I tend to do this thing that nobody really likes. I bet you that given enough time, if you start leaning into that thing, people are going to start recognizing it, and people may not like what you do up front. Okay. When I started painting, nobody cared. Nobody cared that I painted. Heck, I write and nobody cares about my writing. I'm okay with that. I haven't been over time, so I'll be honest, but I've come to a place where I'm like, I don't care, because not everybody likes my writing, and that's fine, because the people who do like my writing like it because it's my writing. Does that make sense? I don't want to write for the masses. I don't, that's my goal, right? because there is a fine line. I'll talk about it maybe in another video about writing for commercial and, writing for what you want, or making art commercially and making art for what you want. There is a balance, and you can kind of go to the extreme of one or the other, but ultimately just lean into what makes your stuff yours and celebrate that. Okay. The last thing is, if you find that you are just constantly comparing yourself to other artists or authors or whatever, you should probably take a break from social media. And I'm not just prescribing that. I'm saying it's probably healthy mentally to take a break from social media. I know it's difficult, and I know that, not everybody is going to want to do that, but taking a break even for a few days can kind of help reset that cycle. And if at the very minimum, start looking at things that are not what you do, because sometimes we just get in this not a rabbit hole, but we almost get stuck in this loophole of just looking at stuff that's similar to what we do. And so we start taking on all these things because it's similar. Sometimes you need to just break that loose, right? And start enjoying things outside of it. So for instance, since I'm writing a dark action fantasy novel, I don't want to read just dark action fantasy novels. I want to read other things, or watch shows or good movies that have good writing, so that maybe I can get inspiration from things that are not already in the thing, because it's harder to compare what you're doing to what someone else is doing if it's in a completely different domain, right? So it's hard for me to compare my writing to a movie because they're two different mediums. Now, can I? Of course I could, irrationally. But my point is if I'm looking at fantasy novels, I might compare my book to other fantasy novels. But if I'm writing a fantasy novel and go out and watch movies that are completely unrelated, I'm not going to compare it, but I might get inspiration from it. So sometimes you need to break that loop of just looking at me, almost like an echo chamber, where you're just kind of only taking in the mediums that are similar to yours. But if you break that, you take a break from social media, or you go out and you absorb media that you can kind of refresh, reflect on, and it's unrelated, that can help you kind of, reset. Ultimately, I don't have any grand things to say about this to close out the video. What I want to do is just encourage you to, if you're struggling with this comparison trap, to take a break. Take a step back and analyze where you are in that trap. Are you constantly comparing yourself to other artists in your industry? If you are, you probably need to take a break. And if you're not comparing yourself to your old work, then maybe you should look at your old work and be proud of the fact that you've progressed in a certain amount of time, and say, you know what? I have gotten better, and I don't need to be this other person that is well ahead of me. And in fact, I need to celebrate what sets me apart and really lean into that thing that makes me unique, and find a way to really hone that to really set myself apart from everyone else. So ultimately, that's it for the video. I know it's kind of a different one, but it really was weighing heavily on me, and I wanted to share. So that's it. I will see you guys in the next one. Take care. God bless.